Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Labor trafficking is a crime that's often hidden in plain sight. It happens in restaurants, construction, janitorial, landscaping services, among others. How do we address this crime that's often overlooked? Our guest may have some answers. He is Pedro Nava, the chair of California's Little Hoover Commission that recently issued a report on the whole problem of labor trafficking. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
All right, can you provide some background on this? Well, first, the issue of human trafficking generally, and then labor trafficking in particular?
Yeah, I think people are familiar with sex trafficking, but not so familiar with labor trafficking. And labor trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or conversion to deprive a victim of liberty, the purpose of obtaining labor or sexual services. What we're really talking about is when someone, through different various means, force, oppression, gets you to work in a way that you're not receiving the appropriate pay or you're paid at all, or you feel as though, quite frankly, you're enslaved.
Yeah, and it's what's interesting is when I was doing your report, which really frankly shocked me, that the legislation, outlawing this is relatively of recent origin. I mean, the federal government really had its first statute in 2000, California 2005, so it hasn't been that long. The other thing that kind of is interesting in your report, you said that the extent of labor trafficking in California really is unknown. How can that be?
It should be, and people should be embarrassed. We should be embarrassed by how little we know. I like to say you can't manage what you don't measure, and we don't measure the extent of labor trafficking. We have a better handle on sex trafficking, but very little information is put in any one place about labor trafficking. And that is in part because the folks that are connected to either enforcement or observation, they're siloed. They don't work together. They don't share information. There's no single place where you can go to find out how serious this problem is.
Yeah, and it kind of follows up. Your report says that California is focused on just one part of the problem, and I think I know what you're going to say about that.
Yeah, sex trafficking is a horrendous crime, and victims suffer deplorable conditions and dehumanizing, and there's violence associated with it. It is just awful. And that has actually earned most of the attention. Now, there's a lot of reasons why, but we think that an examination of human trafficking is going to reveal numbers even larger, far larger than victims of sexual trafficking.
I mean, sex trafficking, it's very salacious. There is a saying that if it bleeds, it leads. Something that grabs people's attention. Sex trafficking certainly grabs people's attention. Labor trafficking, though, is also a very big problem. So what are you recommending to get a better understanding of the problem?
Well, we're one of our first recommendations is that we believe the governor should establish a council. It's relatively inexpensive considering how much these things tend to cost. But you bring together stakeholders, people who are involved in providing services and care for victims of human trafficking, law enforcement, legislators, social service industries, as well as business owners, and focus on the problem of human trafficking. Other states have done it. California is behind. We shouldn't be, and it's a relatively, we think, easy approach to at least understanding the significance of the problem.
But you're also going to have some staffing with that too. So it's not that that's going to be a huge ticket item, particularly when you're considering a $227 billion state budget. And this is an important problem, but there'll also be some money for staffing, I would assume.
Well, we think we can probably get it done for $2 to $3 million. And given the significance of the California budget and the impacts to California.
I was just going to say, it's funny, since I moved to California, they talk about $2 or $3 million is literally budget dust. That it's very small. When you think about how serious this problem is, it seemed to be something to seriously consider allocating some resources to. Up next, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other strategies we can do to address the problem of labor trafficking in California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Pedro Nava, the chair of California's Little Hoover Commission, that recently issued a report on labor trafficking in California. So I want to ask you, Pedro, what are some of the obstacles in identifying labor trafficking?
Well, some of the obstacles. Well, first of all, let's establish the importance of California. California in the United States is actually the most common destination for trafficking, and California, out of all of the states, is the one that receives the greatest number of human trafficking victims. Now, we can't be really specific about which industries do it, but there have been studies that have been made, and it causes me to think about, you remember Willie Sutton, famous bank robber, and they would ask him, why do you rob banks? And he goes, because that's where money is. Well, in California, what it looks like in terms of the industries that have the greatest incidence of trafficking are domestic work, traveling sales crews, begging and peddling rings, agriculture, restaurant food service, health and beauty service, retail and construction. So, that's where the money is, and that's where the trafficking is. And those are the businesses that attract a fair number of undocumented individuals, people who work for low wages, who are subject to pressure and intimidation and fear. And part of the problem of identifying human trafficking is, quite frankly, there's a lack of training for people who are involved in enforcement. So, for example, if you're looking at sexual trafficking, there has been money that has been invested in training for law enforcement so they know what to look for. There are signs and indications of things that are appropriate. And so if you're a law enforcement officer and you see those things, it goes, okay, I'm going to take a deeper look at that. We don't necessarily provide that kind of training for human trafficking. And so as a result, it's often overlooked. I'm reminded of a story from a witness, victim, survivor that we talked with, who was a domestic worker taking care of children. And her situation came to light only because a neighbor noticed that she was always pushing a baby carriage and on every day of the week, and didn't seem to have any time where she wasn't working in that particular capacity. So this person spoke with the survivor and found out that she was working 7 days a week, all hours forever, and that the family that basically hired her were holding her documents so that if she wanted to leave, she couldn't. So
that's what you would think would happen. They're holding the documents. Right. So what are some of the ways, and you've listed in your report some of the ways that California can do a better job in dealing with labor trafficking? Why don't you discuss some of those?
Well, one of the things, there are social service workers who come in contact with people all of the time, who could be better trained on what to look for, could be trained on what sorts of questions that they ought to be asking someone so they can get a better understanding of what their living situation is. Now, there's also the opportunity to expand the eyes and ears of people to get information about labor trafficking. And I'll give you an example, because you don't need sworn peace officers all of the time to do this work. So if you are a food and restaurant inspector, then you work for the county. You're often going into places. If you knew to look for things at a facility, so for example, if it looked like there were certain kinds of lockers with clothing, if there were mattresses, and it looked like people were sleeping within that facility, that might be something that would tell you to ask some more questions so you could find out what's going on with that person. So healthcare workers, emergency room staff can be trained to know what to look for and what kinds of questions to ask, so that we can get a better handle on how profound and widespread human trafficking is.
Yeah, you also mentioned in your report, establishing reporting protocols, better use of data and technology, expand existing statutory protections that maybe they need to be expanded somewhat, and then education, outreach in some of these high-risk communities all make a lot of sense in addressing this problem. Well, up next, what about the victims of labor trafficking? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with the chair of California's Little Hoover Commission, Pedro Nava, about an unrecognized and therefore generally unaddressed problem, the issue of labor trafficking. What can be done to assist those who've been victims of labor trafficking? That's our conversation now. And I want to ask you, Pedro, what's the state currently doing to help labor trafficking victims and survivors?
Yeah, there are a number of programs that the state is involved in. And they tend to be focused in a couple of two different agencies, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, or OES, as well as the California Victim Compensation Board. So the OES offers direct services. So they fund different community-based organizations that work with survivors, and they do things like crisis intervention, counseling. People need shelter, so they provide emergency shelter, or they help line up emergency shelter for these folks. They do referrals to different agencies in the community so that survivors can get assistance. And then they also help them apply for benefits, because it can be very intimidating if you are someone who is involved, a victim of labor trafficking. It's a scary time for you. It's a scary time to leave your work, even though it's not what it's supposed to be. There's a large percentage of victims of labor trafficking who are women. Many of them have children. So it's not a simple thing of just sort of picking up and going someplace else. Now, the Victims Compensation Board, they offer financial assistance to help pay for medical bills and other expenses. Because remember, if these folks have been labor trafficked, they've walked away from a job, or they've left a job that was their only source of income and support. So they desperately need help. So you've got the OES and the Victim Compensation Board. Now, there's other state-administered programs that are specifically focused at high-risk groups, such as foster youth, unfortunately, are also a target of labor trafficking, and again, immigrants who are taken advantage of.
Yeah, you're seeing the same populations that are being taken advantage of. I want to ask you about some of the barriers you outlined some in your report. Some of the barriers that make it difficult for these folks to get help. What kinds of barriers do these survivors and victims experience?
Well, I can let me give you an example. There's a woman by the name of Angela who was being labor trafficked, and she was in the Philippines. So a lot of what we have to do is complicated by the fact that there are people who recruit others to take work in the United States, and what they find out is it's nothing that they were told was going to be. So it's not unusual for someone to be recruited to come to the United States and then find out and be told that they owe a large amount of money in order to place them in a job and for the travel. So they take their documents. So if you've got a passport, your passport is now gone. Your visa is now gone. You may extend the time of your visa. And so you are now in the country illegally, and the labor trafficker tells you, if you don't do what I tell you, I'm going to report you and you're going to be deported. And so it makes life for those folks extremely, extremely difficult.
Yeah, you hear kind of those things, those reports on nannies, right? Where they do that kind of stuff, and they have them working all these ridiculous, crazy hours, and the person is really stuck. There's nothing they can do. They can't report it to the authorities because they're now, they have no documentation, et cetera. You state in your report that, quote, California must do more to understand where labor trafficking occurs through the state, how victims access help, and the kinds of programs most effective in helping survivors recover and thrive. So what are your specific recommendations in that regard?
Well, we found that again, there's an absence of information, and so it makes it difficult to get your arms around the enormity of the problem. Um, but one of the things that California should do to be more efficient is we need to track the services that are provided to the survivors so that we have one place where we can take a look at what's being done and evaluate how successful those measures are. We also need to research and evaluate those programs because there are ways to improve services, and I think California taxpayers deserve to see that that money is being well spent. And then we have to develop and maintain a user-friendly directory of all of the state and local resources for survivors. Otherwise, it's a daunting task for someone to try to figure out where to go get help. So even if you want to get help, you're not sure what it is that you're supposed to do.
Yeah, there's got to be like a one-stop shop place that people can say, these are the kinds of assistance I can get to get me out of this very difficult situation. Well, up next, we're going to talk about how do you bring labor traffickers to justice. Important point. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. You know, while labor trafficking is a problem, on average, there are fewer than 30 convictions for labor trafficking in California each year. We're talking with Pedro Nava, the chair of California's Little Hoover Commission, about their report on labor trafficking in California. So I wanted to ask you, what are the state agencies that are currently involved in bringing these traffickers to justice?
Well, there's primarily two. So you have the Department of Justice, and then interestingly enough, you also have the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. So the Department of Justice pursues criminal cases, and the Department of Employment and Housing pursues civil cases. But unfortunately, we don't have a central place where we can keep track of exactly how many prosecutions and convictions have been.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be, someone doesn't really have primary responsibility for this. You know, I'm going to ask you about some of the obstacles that you found in your report to enforcing laws against labor trafficking. What did you find?
Well, what's interesting is that you have California agencies that you would think would be the agency that would be best suited to bring an action. So, for example, EDD or labor, but they don't have the authority to do that. Now, the other thing that complicates it is that labor trafficking cases are very complicated. And what we found was that if you are a deputy DA or a prosecutor in a county, and you're looking at a labor trafficking case, that means you've got to know employment law, you've got to know tax law, you've got to know civil aspects of civil law, and you also have to be able to do the prosecution of cases. And there isn't a lot of training, or there aren't investigators that are that plentiful that are familiar with that kind of scope of different aspects of the law. And neither are prosecutors educated and trained in that many aspects of the law. I mean, I know I was a deputy DA in Fresno County for a number of years, and it's a lot easier to prosecute a narcotics case than it's going to be to do a labor trafficking case.
Yeah, labor cases typically, they are, no pun intended, labor intensive. We've got to talk to a lot of people, collect a lot of facts, and then there's these overlap of different areas of law that you have to know to do it. You also mentioned, there's an option for civil enforcement, but they've underutilized that. They really haven't used civil enforcement. That could be a potential tool.
Well, and I think also what we found in our report and talking to people who work with survivors as well as survivors is that they oftentimes feel more comfortable retaining an attorney who will work on a contingency basis, a private attorney on a contingency basis to bring their civil case instead of going to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And so if you pursue a civil case with a private attorney that is based in labor trafficking, that's not going to be reported in a database that is available. Now, there is some work being done by independent researchers that have to go through court dockets and other sources of information to try to pull together the numbers of civil cases that have been brought. But civil litigation is one way for a survivor to at least get back some of the money that they were owed, as well as some satisfaction, right, for punishment of a wrongdoer.
Yeah, you also suggest prioritizing labor trafficking enforcement. What are your specific recommendations in that regard?
Again, we go back to the training. What is the training that has been provided to people in order to identify labor trafficking? You need additional investigation so that what we just is a fairly complex way of approaching investigation and evidence gathering is done. We ought to empower more state agencies to investigate labor trafficking. That way that you've actually leveraged the skill and training of people that you have in different agencies. We need to track, again, civil and criminal labor trafficking enforcement and study the outcomes so that we can develop best practices. And then we need, I sound like a broken record, but it is about training. It is about teaching people in positions of responsibility and enforcement what to look for and how to apply it.
Yeah, and the other thing that you've actually said in a number of issues, which is a very important point I want to underscore, is that you got to count it. You got to know what you're looking at. And if you're not collecting the data, you really don't know how big the problem is. And then if you try to address that problem, whether what you're using to address that problem is actually working. I want to ask you before we go, we've only got about 30 seconds left, but I did want to ask you about a question that's not in your report. And it's an emerging issue that's of increasing importance. And that is this, as the economy expands with the gig economy, we've got now employees, we have independent contractors, now this kind of third classification with gig workers. And I'm just wondering, how does this whole development of this new kind of worker, this gig worker, who's kind of a quasi-employee, quasi-independent contractor, impact the labor trafficking issue, or vice versa?
Well, I think if you were to ask some of the members of the legislature, they would tell you that, in their opinion, many of these gig workers are in fact being labor trafficked. Because when you assess how much money they actually take home compared to the expenses that they have to put into it, not very lucrative. But I do think, again, the point is that you can't manage what you don't measure. And we're not measuring activities in many different areas of labor.
And we'll have to leave it there. I want to thank Pedro Nava with the Little Hoover Commission for joining us and giving us information on an important issue that we should all learn a little bit more about. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.